evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. I know with the way the roads and the storms and everything, it probably wasn't easy for a lot of you to get here. My name is Karen Gaudian. I am chair of Lyme Connection, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual conference. We are very excited about tonight's special program. We have some really unique guests for you tonight and some really exciting news. And first, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their generosity of time and energy to be here with us. And I'd also like to thank our exhibitors. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to hold these programs. Many of them have been here with us since our start. I'd also like to thank the volunteers who have come out to help us tonight in order to make this evening possible. And I'd encourage all of you to get involved with organizations in your area. It's only by working together that we're actually going to make a difference and take care of Lyme and tick-borne diseases. It was 2003 when two moms with very sick children started to look for answers. Jennifer Reid was worried that other families might be struggling as we were, and she invited a group of people together. So we started planning our first program. When Ridgefield's first selectman, Rudy Marconi, heard about our program, he asked to meet with us. He wanted to know what was going on because this is the first time he had people coming into his office yelling at him about a disease. On the evening of our very first meeting, we found ourselves accidentally locked out of town hall. And that's when a waiting gentleman stepped forward and offered us his office. And that was the first time I met Steve Phillips. Much to our surprise, he had come out to our little local town meeting. At that very first meeting, we had no agenda, no real plan, no idea what we were in for, but gathering reinforced our determination to do something. 15 years ago, I would not have believed that we would be here today with all of you. Back then, I knew very little about politics, medicine, science, support groups, fundraising, or even agendas. I was barely using a computer, and certainly you would never have found me in front of all of you. I also would not have believed that 15 years later, patients would still be struggling to find an appropriate diagnosis, or that we would still be struggling to find doctors who are knowledgeable in the treatment of tick-borne diseases. Or, as so many of you know, that those knowledgeable physicians would have waiting lists that are months and sometimes years long because there just aren't enough of these knowledgeable physicians to help. I would never have believed that the infectious disease docs and the CDC would still be claiming that Lyme disease is hard to get, easy to diagnose, and easy to cure. That the medical community continues to diagnose and treat patients with anything and everything but Lyme disease. It also never crossed my mind that science and medicine would be powered by political bias and financial ambition. Although as humans, we are by nature flawed, and there are too many who are driven by personal gain, there are some really wonderful exceptions to this theory. Tonight, we are very honored to have a few of those exceptions here with us. Our speakers tonight are truly remarkable people with brilliant minds who have devoted their lives and work every day to find effective treatments and, yes, cures for Lyme and other tick-borne diseases. People who have risked their careers and their reputations to find truth. People who understand that this is just the right thing to do. Here to introduce our first guest tonight is my partner, Jennifer Reid.
Thank you, Karen. And welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. So we start off with this special moment every year. We begin this patient conference, thank you, Rob, by acknowledging the contributions of outstanding individuals in the world of tick-borne illness. We define outstanding as persons who go beyond their peers to positively impact the lives of patients stricken by these devastating diseases. Practitioners who demonstrate unique compassion, researchers who risk their reputations, advocates who devote decades to the battle, and journalists who, for whatever reason, are determined to tell our stories in the most honest way possible. I'm certain that none of our award winners imagined early on that Lyme disease would play a significant role in their lives. Like most of us, they thought Lyme was an easy-to-treat illness that required little attention, until that outlook proved to be incorrect. Moved by the suffering they witnessed, these caring individuals chose not to turn away, and we will all be forever grateful. Tonight, we are honored to present one such individual, Lew Leone, Vice President and General Manager of WNYW Fox 5 New York, with our Courage in Journalism Award. Lew began to learn about the complexities and controversies in the world of Lyme after his wife Wendy became ill with the disease. He soon discovered friends and coworkers were experiencing similar medical issues. As a communicator, Lew felt it was important to raise awareness and believed he would make an impact. Together with producer Joe Silvestri, host Teresa Paella, and other Fox 5 team members, Lew created the groundbreaking program Lyme and Reason, The Cause and Consequence of Lyme Disease, which first aired on June 30, 2016. This moving 22-minute special report discussed the cause and effects of Lyme disease, controversies over testing and misdiagnosis, and the personal struggles of patients and medical professionals. In fact, it featured many of the speakers joining us tonight. The station entered into a long dialogue with viewers via Facebook and email, receiving thousands of messages about the program in the days after it aired. In addition to posting the original program on YouTube, the station took the unusual step of posting many of the original interviews in their entirety, almost 3 hours of additional material for viewers to see. Fox 5 New York even allowed Dr. Phillips to respond on his Facebook page to statements made on the program that he thought were misleading. And they then produced a follow-up special report on Lyme disease that aired in November 2016, Lyme and Reason 2.0, The Voices of Change. We are pleased to tell you that the Lyme and Reason team received an Emmy Award for this outstanding work from the New York chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences in May 2017. Lew's efforts to educate and advocate continue on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you'll find him responding regularly to current events in the world of Lyme disease. He is a Global Lyme Alliance board member and a trusted friend to tonight's research trailblazers. In a world where too few people are helping us tell our story, we acknowledge the courage of tonight's award winner for sending our message worldwide. On behalf of everyone whose life has been positively impacted by the educational efforts of tonight's Courage in Journalism Award winner, please join me in honoring our guest, Lew Leone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Karen, for those kind words. And Jennifer, you touched on a lot of it there. I didn't know you had all that information. Thank you. So some of what I might say tonight might be a little bit repetitive, but I want to tell my story and the story of my wife anyway. So Jennifer's right and Karen's right. I never thought I'd be receiving an award for Lyme disease or even involved with Lyme disease, but it's really become a huge part of my life, and I wake up every single day and think about it, and think about how my wife is doing, and how our kids are doing. And the connection has been incredible. I'll get it together in a second here. So thank you for this honor. It really, you can see it means a lot to me. So my wife, Wendy, was diagnosed with Lyme disease in 2014, and it was the typical story, right? So typical story I hear from people with chronic Lyme all the time. So she was misdiagnosed for about a year with everything from lupus to fibromyalgia to menopause, and she did have menopause, but that wasn't causing her pain. And since I think everything is connected, I wanted to tell you her story and how I think things are all connected. So I met this woman at a party we started talking about my wife, and she had chronic pain. And she said, oh, your wife has to go see the body whisperer. Who's the body whisperer? He's this guy named Shmuel Taz. And he worked at Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center with all of the ballerinas and dancers and musicians on their necks and on their backs. And he was the body whisperer. He got rid of their pain. So he saw my wife a couple of times, and he said, I don't think you're a fibromyalgia. There's something wrong with you. There's something systemic. You need to go see a doctor. So she went to see, he recommended Dr. Lew Leone in New York City. She came in with all her symptoms, and he said, I think you might have Lyme disease. And he was right. And we were ecstatic. We're like, oh, we finally have a diagnosis. And now we can just get on and take some antibiotics, and Wendy will be better. So that was just the beginning of our journey. Needless to say, Wendy did not get better, and she's doing okay now, but she still receives treatment every day, and she's struggling. And that's the beginning. That's how our story started. And as Jennifer mentioned, so I would talk to my friends about it and ask how Wendy's doing, and it seemed like everyone I spoke to had a connection to Lyme disease. Oh, so-and-so, you should call this person. They have Lyme disease, and someone in their family has Lyme disease. I didn't realize how prevalent it was. And I started doing some research. And lo and behold, I found out about the unreliable tests, the controversy, the conflicting treatment options, issues with insurance, which is a big one. And I found out about all the people who couldn't get better. I also read about now he's the senator, but now it was your Attorney General, Blumenthal, who filed a lawsuit against the IDSA for their conflicts of interest in their Lyme guidelines and treatments. And I said, this is really a big problem. I don't see any of this, any of this coverage in the media. I think we need to do some stories on it. So we started doing some stories, and then one day 3 people from the Global Lyme Alliance showed up in my office, and they said, what are you doing? I'm like, what do you mean? They said, you're doing all these stories on Lyme disease. Why are you doing it? So I told them my story. They asked me to join their board, and I just want to give a shout out to the Global Lyme Alliance. I think it's an incredible organization. We're raising money for research, for better testing. They're doing an educational program. They're doing a great camp program, and I'm proud to be involved with the Global Lyme Alliance. Next, I'd like to say to all of you, thank God for Yolanda Hadid, because I think that she really took the awareness of Lyme to the next level. And by chance, I had an opportunity to go see Yolanda at the Dr. Oz. She did the Dr. Oz show. And she was able to tell her story to Dr. Oz. I was able to meet Yolanda. But more importantly, also at that taping was Dana Parish, who's here tonight, and Norma Albaspino, who was a board member of Global Lyme Alliance. They handed me a copy of the book called Gone in a Heartbeat by Dr. Neil Spector. Coincidentally, I got back to my office, and there was another copy of Dr. Spector's book, Gone in a Heartbeat, in my office. And I said, I guess I'm supposed to read this book. It must be a requirement to be a board member, so I'll pick it up, I'll slog my way through it, and we'll see what happens. Well, I picked up that book, and I didn't put it down. It was, you're going to hear from Dr. Spector in a few minutes. He's just a beautiful human being. I'd encourage you to read his book, his story with Lyme disease, and he wore the white coat. He was in the medical establishment, and he had the same problems that many of us have had with Lyme disease. The other thing I did after that Dr. Oz show, where I met Dana, was I went back to my office and Googled Dana Parish. And I came upon her Huffington Post story, how 11 top New York City doctors missed my Lyme disease. So it was all sort of fate, that meeting at the Dr. Oz show, that I would get to know Dana. She would be in our specials. I would get to know Dr. Spector. He would be in our specials. And Dana would introduce me to Dr. Phillips. And it's through my association with the 3 individuals who you're going to hear from tonight, that they inspire me every day to do more for Lyme disease. So we continued to do stories. We had so much material on Lyme disease. We did some specials, as Jennifer mentioned. We had star power. We had Yolanda Hadid, Marlon Maples, Allie Hilfiger, Talia. We had brain power with Dr. Phillips, who I think is the smartest person I know in Lyme disease. Dr. Spector, Kim Lewis, a renowned researcher, Dr. Elena Frid, Lorraine Johnson from LymeDisease.org. And we also told stories of patients like Julia Bruzeza, who you may have seen. She was the young girl in the wheelchair, suffered from Lyme, and was blessed by the Pope on his visit here to New York City. I just wanted, and I also want to add that we did also, in these specials, we let the CDC, come on and talk about their opinions on how what's going on with Lyme. And I just tell you a note about the CDC. And last June, they put out a highly sensationalized report on how long-term antibiotic treatment was killing people. And I can tell you, because I work with many journalists, that some of them are lazy, and they just will regurgitate a press release. And that's what happened. The Washington Post picked up that story from the CDC. They splashed it across their paper and headlines, and it was a big deal that, if you take long-term antibiotics for Lyme disease, you're gonna kill people, which was incredibly misleading, politically motivated. And I think it was really a shot across the bow of all the good people, including those here, that are working and advocating for Lyme, raising funding for research and developing better testing. So I just don't want us to kid ourselves. I mean, it's really kind of a war going on out there over Lyme disease. Jennifer also mentioned our resource on our YouTube channel. I encourage everyone because I get calls every day from people that have Lyme disease, and I encourage them, first, listen, go check out our website, watch all this stuff, and educate yourself, and then call me back and we'll talk. I also like to say that there's a 40-minute interview with Dana Parish and Dr. Phillips on there. It's been viewed over 35,000 times. So there's a lot of people that just heard about our coverage and are watching our content, and I think it's very helpful. So just a couple more points. Really, the only positive aspects of my wife's long-suffering illness have been the connections that I've made with the people that are willing to help. People like the ones I've mentioned, and countless others, like 13-year-old Olivia Goudreau, who developed a tick tracker app, Nicole Green from the Office of Health and Human Services, Susan Green she's the amazing lawyer for NatCap Line, Brandy Dean, who founded the Dean Center at Harvard Medical College, her Dr. Nev Zubevnik, who runs the Dean Center, Chloe O'Brien from More Than Lyme, who I encourage you to follow. These are people that my wife Wendy can't wait to emulate when she gets better and she can help others. But I also think there's much hope for Lyme disease. Awareness, I think, has been raised to a new level. We have a federal advisory committee, which is meeting as we speak, which will issue a report to Congress. More money has been allocated by the government, and research dollars are starting to flow. Very smart people like Dr. Phillips, Neil Spector, and Dana Parish are working on cures. They inspire me every day. I can assure you that as long as I have a say in the matter, our TV station will continue to raise awareness and offer responsible coverage of this epidemic. So thank you very much, Karen and Jennifer. I really appreciate this honor.
Thank you so much, Lew. That was really incredible. So our next guest actually couldn't be here tonight, but he still wanted to participate. Dr. Neil Spector is one of those special people that has those exceptionally brilliant minds. He also has, as Lew mentioned, a very generous heart. I had the privilege of meeting him just a couple weeks ago up in Maine, and he really is amazing. And hopefully you'll get a sense of what he's truly like from his video. Dr. Spector is actually a Duke University oncologist in cancer research, and also he is author of the book Gone in a Heartbeat. And in his book, he talks about being sick, and he shares his experiences that so many of us have gone through from doctor to doctor trying to get help in a diagnosis and being told it's all in your head. So it has nothing to do with you. Ultimately, unfortunately, Dr. Spector did lose his heart and had to undergo a heart transplant. He is also renowned in the field of breast cancer for his discovery of 2 life-saving drugs, He's presently working with Dr. Phillips and Dana Parish on a first-of-its-kind joint research project through Duke University, Johns Hopkins, and Tulane universities, applying the precision medicine techniques used in the field of cancer and HIV to tick-borne diseases in efforts to help us find a cure. So we're very excited about this.
I'd like to thank the Lyme Connection for inviting me to participate in this wonderful meeting, and I only wish that I could be there in person. So next year I'll be there. So I'm Neil Spector. I am a cancer researcher at Duke, but I like to call myself the triple threat. I'm a clinician, I'm a scientist, I'm also a survivor of a pretty severe case of Lyme disease that I just want to start out by giving you a background of how I got to be involved in this whole field. So I was really the model of health. In my early 30s, I ran Boston marathons, used to run 10 miles a day, 6 days a week, had a great job at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, had found the woman of my dreams. I mean, life was really good. And I was the physician, so I wore the white coats. I wasn't supposed to be somebody who got sick. And then literally, we moved from Boston to Miami, and within a very short period of time, I went from running 10 miles a day to barely being able to walk 10 yards without completely feeling like I was fatigued. And then I had an episode of brain fog. Many of you are going to be able to relate to this. You know, I tell people it was like taking 50 milligrams of Benadryl every 2 hours. I was working, by the way, full-time, taking care of people on a bone marrow transplant unit, running my lab. I once gave a lecture in a biochemistry department at the University of Miami, the medical school. Walked out after an hour. Somebody said it was really great research. I had absolutely no recollection of what I just talked about. So, and then the other thing that was very alarming was I was having these cardiac arrhythmias. So my heart, for no apparent reason, would just start racing to 200, 250 beats a minute. That might last anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute. And then it would be gone. And every time I'd go to an emergency room, I'd have this exhaustive workup, EKGs, blood tests, the standard blood tests, and everything would come back fine. And so I was always told that I was stressed. I had a lab, I was taking care of sick patients. And so I went on 4 years. This was going on. I literally felt every morning like that could be the last morning that I'd live. And I knew that I was dying. I didn't know what I was dying from, but I knew it wasn't from stress. I kept having the cardiac arrhythmias, extreme fatigue. I was having this incredible burning sensation in my heels. Huge problem with insomnia, nightmares, these very vivid nightmares. Again, many of you are going to relate to these problems. You know, and so I'm a physician. I'm a scientist. I know that clearly something's wrong. I know that I've been stressed in my life. I know that I've, as a resident, used to work 120 hours a week and never felt these symptoms. And so, to make a long story short, eventually I developed arthritis, and I was given doxycycline for a completely independent reason. And the arthritis resolved very quickly. And so I started to piece together, you know, arthritis, doxycycline, and then I developed a persistently slow heart rate, which finally was worked up and found out that I had third-degree heart block. So the wiring in my system was completely screwed up. Again, a manifestation of Lyme disease, cardiac conduction defects. So I told my doctors I have Lyme disease. They tested me. They were going to put a permanent pacemaker in. It turns out I got called, said the test is negative, you don't have Lyme disease. I knew I had Lyme disease. So for several months, I kept fighting with my doctors to repeat the test, and finally the test came back positive from the IgM standpoint, but I didn't have sufficient bands in IgG. But anyway, I was treated for Lyme disease. I had a PICC line put in. I got 3 months of intravenous antibiotics, 1 month of high-dose oral antibiotics. All my symptoms got better with the exception of the cardiac problems. I, at that time, had a defibrillator pacemaker put in. I lived the next 12 years with pacemaker, defibrillator, having a potentially fatal arrhythmia called ventricular tachycardia thousands of times over those years, any number of which times I could have died. And finally, in 2009, I went into heart failure. And so on a July evening, was admitted to the intensive care unit and was told essentially that I had 72 hours to live without a heart transplant. 36 hours after being placed on the transplant list, I had the transplant, and here I am today. It wasn't quite an easy trek after the transplant. I had some other things happen, but thankfully I survived. And I realized, during this time that there's real problems. I mean, I've been involved, I've published in the best journal, scientific journal. I trained at Harvard. I'm a faculty member at Duke. And yet I realized that this field is sorely lacking bad diagnostics. We need better therapies. All of you know that. People can't be taking antibiotics for 5 years. We just need to be much smarter about the way we view this disease. And I didn't fully understand, number one, why I wasn't taken seriously as a physician scientist. My own peers didn't listen to me. When I told them something was wrong, they told me I was stressed. And so, since my transplant, I've gotten, and since I wrote my book, Gone in a Heartbeat, A Physician's Search for True Healing, I've gotten called by, hundreds or thousands of people have called me, emailed me. And the stories are always the same. Why don't people listen to me? Why are things, why doesn't the medical profession recognize this as a real problem? And so, I've decided that I need to do something about that. More than just answering all the emails, I decided that I needed to switch my research interest and try to make a difference in the lives of people. And so what we've done is, thankfully I've been very lucky in having developed 2 cancer drugs that were what we call smart targeted therapies. So they're drugs that are based on using molecular information of cancer cells and trying to target the Achilles heels of cancer cells and sparing normal cells. And so we developed a drug that targets a particular, what we call a growth factor in 15 to 20% of breast cancers called HER2, HER2, that used to be, when women were told that they had HER2 positive breast cancer, they would cry because it was the most aggressive form of breast cancer. And in general, they would probably, more likely than not, be dead within 9 to 12 months of getting a diagnosis of advanced stage HER2 breast cancer. I was lucky to be involved in the development of a pill that targets the HER2 receptor in breast cancer cells, pretty much to the exclusion of most of the normal tissues in the body. And now we have women, for the first time in my life, that we're actually saying, gee, I think we could actually cure women with HER2 positive breast cancer. So now women actually cry when they're told that they don't have HER2 positive breast cancers because we have about 4 or 5 good targeted therapies for that disease. And so I went to some of my colleagues, one in particular at Duke, who I've been working with for 12 years since I've been there, and said, why can't we do this for Lyme disease, for Bartonella, for some of the tick-borne illnesses? Why do we have to rely on antibiotics? Now, I've given talks, I've made the analogy that there's a lot of similarities between the biology of Borrelia, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, Bartonella, and cancer. I'm not saying that one causes the other, although we're studying that as well. But what I'm saying is there are a lot of parallels, a lot of similarities that we could say, here's what worked in cancer. Can we make this work for these diseases? Can we actually develop smart therapies that take advantage of the known genomes for these bacteria and target specific enzymes, protective mechanisms in bacteria that will exclude normal tissues, so won't affect the normal microbiome like antibiotics do. And by the way, I want to make this point. I'm not saying people should not be taking antibiotics, because right now that's all we have. In addition to herbal supplements, what I'm saying is that we can and we will do better. I'm going to make you that promise right here. So thanks to the Cohen Foundation, we now have a very large grant where in 3 years, a very aggressive mission, we're going from discovering new targets using the genome of Borrelia and Bartonella as starters and developing targeted therapies. And then we're going to take that in 3 years all the way to primate models. So we have a collaboration between investigators in my lab, another investigator at Duke, Monica Embers at Tulane, who runs the Primate Center and has probably the best Lyme disease model in primates, Ying Zhang at Hopkins. So we put together a consortium, collaborative effort to tackle this major problem. And we've already started to identify compounds through screens at Duke that have identified very exciting potential, I'll say potential drugs, because we're still in the preclinical stages, but we're very excited about the identification of compounds that are targeting the proteins that we've decided are good ones to target in these bacteria, Borrelia and Bartonella. And so we're going to take that, we're going to advance it from the laboratory into animal models, and then hopefully into human clinical trials. The other part of that, by the way, is we're going to use those same, and we've done this in cancer, we want to develop what's called a theranostic. We could take those same molecules that specifically target the bacteria, put an imaging moiety, something that we could image by an MRI or a PET scan that will specifically target the bacteria. So let me give you an example. So in breast cancer, we're using this to distinguish between abnormalities on mammography that are not malignant, and therefore women shouldn't have to have a biopsy, or those that are malignant. This is better than PET scans, this is better than SPECT scans, both of which are very non-specific. Imagine you go to a doctor and you say, I got pain in my left shoulder and I got pain in my heart. And we had a scan that could distinguish if that was related to Borrelia or Bartonella or potentially Babesia. So we would give you an imaging reagent. The imaging reagent would then light up if you had Borrelia in your left shoulder and in your heart. It would light up, and we'd say, you know what? That scan is so specific for those bacteria that you've got it. That would be, to me, that would be transformative. You could go to a doctor, you could have a scan, you could have a specific Borrelia scan, a Bartonella scan. Maybe we would find targets that would be common to most of these tick-borne illnesses. But there'd be no ambiguity. It wouldn't be based on a Western blot, do you have enough antibodies? It wouldn't be based on PCR, where people could debate PCR. It would be based on actually visualizing the bacteria in your body, and then we would treat you with the targeted therapy. So that's the sort of thing that gets me excited. That's the sort of thing that I envision for this field. That's the sort of thing that if you invite me next year, and I'll put it on my calendar early, that I'll come to you with the data that we're going to be generating over the next 12 months and be able to hopefully provide you with exciting updates. I think this is a perfect segue into another collaboration that I have with Steve Phillips and Dana Parish, who are going to be speaking. I know everyone's excited. Everyone knows Steve Phillips. I mean, he's my hero. Dana's my hero. We're doing some exciting, or I'm doing some exciting work with them as well to develop a therapy that's a bit different from what I just talked about, but one which I think will be equally transformative, particularly for Bartonella, which we know is a major problem. So I'm going to end there. Again, I'm going to thank you for inviting me. I wish I could be there. I hope the video was good. I hope people are excited about what we're doing. I'll put a shameless plug in for my book because there's a lot of interesting things and tells a story really that transcends not just Lyme disease, but really perseverance and the will of the human spirit to survive and overcome adversity. But I'm going to end there, and I'm going to wish all of you a tremendous conference. And again, I hope that what Steve and Dana will talk to you about will be exciting, because I'm very excited about that as well. So thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.
So I'm sorry, I hope you could all hear that well enough. He really is a remarkable man and is doing some really exciting stuff. And the partnership that has evolved with Dana and Steve and Dr. Spector is really exciting. In 15 years, this is the first thing that's really gotten me thinking there's hope for all of us. So the next person to come up tonight is Dana Parish. This is the first night I've actually met Dana, but I've talked to her a few times on the phone, and every time we get talking, we can't stop. She's a remarkable person. She's actually a singer and songwriter with Sony when her life and career were derailed by Lyme and Bartonella. In addition to writing her popular Huffington Post Lyme disease column, which is where I first saw her name. Dana is co-authoring a book with Dr. Phillips that they're going to talk about tonight, chronicling her journey and her experience, or his experience, treating over 20,000 patients with tick-borne diseases. Ms. Parish and Dr. Phillips also co-host interviews covering timely tick-borne disease topics on Facebook chat, and I would highly recommend them. They're nice and compact. You can get a lot of information about very specific topics, and they're extremely helpful. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dana Parish.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've been busier than I realized. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And I want to give a special thank you to Lew Leone, who has single-handedly been the most incredible hero in mainstream media for Lyme. He's forced the conversation forward for all of us. He put Dr. Phillips and I and Neil on his Emmy Award-winning show, his special, Lyme and Reason, and we were so proud to be part of it. So I have to thank Norma for introducing us at Dr. Oz show. I guess I have to thank Dr. Oz one day when we're on his show talking about Lyme disease. That's got to be on the list for all of us. So I'm really thrilled that I'm well enough to be on a stage again. And I want to thank the remarkable team here at Lyme Connection, Karen Gaudian and Jennifer Reid. They have been so supportive of us personally and have helped thousands of people over the last 15 years with this organization. And I don't think I've ever shared with any of them that they serendipitously led me to Dr. Phillips and led me here tonight. And I'll tell you about that later. And first, I was curious, how many of you are newly diagnosed? A few, a bunch, okay. And how many people feel there's no hope, I'm never gonna get better, this is the end of the road? So I hope that my presence and my story here gives you strength and hope tonight, because 3.5 years ago, any of you who felt like that, I was dying. I was in heart failure. I was not able to leave my apartment. I was extremely hopeless, and I could find almost no stories of recovery online or anywhere. I was saddled with crushing fatigue and insomnia and suicidal depression. I never had any of this before. Horrible anxiety, a sense of doom, a sense of dread, weakness, pain, tingling in my hands and feet. I couldn't think. I couldn't follow a simple conversation or a simple story. I had a lot of hallucinations before I went to bed. I was seeing melting faces every time I closed my eyes, and I would stay up all night crying and praying to God to help my family and my friends through my impending death, because I was absolutely certain I was going to die soon. And I do believe that without the proper care, I might have. So a little bit about my background. I was basically born singing and songwriting, and I knew I was going to do that from the time I was a little tiny girl. I told my mom at 4 years old, we were in the car driving, and do you guys remember that song? That's the way, I like it. Yeah, that was on the radio, and I knew every word, and I was like, Mom, I am going to be a singer when I grow up. And she was like, okay, and so I was. I loved the connection that I felt with music, and I loved how I felt so understood. I loved words, and I was always transfixed by genuine emotion and truth and honesty and a soulful voice. And I knew that what mattered to me most was connecting with others and trying to give them something good in the world. And I definitely felt that my highest purpose was always going to be, in some way, to shine light on the truth. So I was taking voice lessons by 10 and wrote and recorded my first song at 14 about my boyfriend called Only You and Me. It's so embarrassing to think about now. It was actually a pretty decent pop song. It wasn't bad for a first song. And I went on to study music at 2 conservatories for college. Nobody could talk me, none of my Jewish family could talk me into being a doctor or a lawyer. They tried super hard. I was absolutely determined as you can probably imagine if you have had any experience with me in any way. I got my first publishing deal at Paramount when I was 26 years old. I was a few years out of college. And I was very fortunate, and I've been very fortunate to live my dream of being an artist and a singer and a songwriter, and singing from my heart and forming deep connections with audiences all over the world. That all stopped suddenly as Lyme and Bartonella dismantled me as I signed my new deal with Sony 3.5 years ago. So what's so bizarre about this strange turn from being an artist to a furious, scorned patient is that when you're a performer, you're told never to show weakness. You're not supposed to say you have a cold, you're not supposed to say you're sick, you're not supposed to say somebody that I love died, so it's hard for me to be on stage tonight. But here I am telling you about the worst, most traumatic episode in my entire life, and how I was entirely failed and dismissed by mainstream medicine, and it almost killed me at all the best New York City institutions. So my life turned upside down after a tick bite on Long Beach Island, New Jersey, July 4th weekend, 2014. I was at my friend's wedding. I didn't hike, I didn't go in the grass, I didn't see a single animal the entire weekend. I just went to the wedding at the house that they rented on a beach. I went to sleep. I woke up and drove back home to New York City, the unwitting carrier of a tick the size of a poppy seed embedded on my shoulder under my bra strap. I will never know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that I was bitten in my sleep. So it sort of blows the whole thing out of the water about being careful when you're outside, because I know that you know what was in my bed. Anyway, a few days later, I woke up with a crushing head and neck ache like I have never experienced, and I couldn't stay awake. I fell into this death-like, coma-like sleep for 2 or 3 days that I had never experienced. And then a few days later, I felt fine. I thought I was fine. But here's the first hard lesson. If you think you have the summer flu, it's probably Lyme. After my flu episode, I got out of the shower and I wrapped a white towel around me. This is a Saturday, just 5 days after I came back from New York, back from Long Beach Island, and I saw a bite on my shoulder with the faint ring around it. So I knew what that meant. That's basically all I knew about Lyme, was that faint little bullseye. So I knew what that meant, and I walked to the emergency room, which was a block from my apartment. And I was given a very wrong and inadequate, IDSA recommended, the Infectious Disease Society of America, recommended 3 weeks of doxycycline. I was not informed that this treatment fails up to 61% of the time, according to a study by Danbury Hospital. I think Johns Hopkins puts that number at 36 or 38%. It's very high no matter how you look at it. I was not told that a longer, stronger course could have saved unimaginable heartache for me and for everybody that loves me and is in my life, and all the colleagues and people at Sony I had just signed this deal with. I was told that Lyme is easy to diagnose and easy to cure, which of course ends up being the biggest lie of all. The doctors unequivocally said I would be fine. They smugly told me to thank God I was not one of those crazy Lyme people. I've never heard of a crazy Lyme person. I have no idea what they're talking about, but I definitely noted that something was extremely strange about that comment. So I took the antibiotics for the 3 weeks until the beginning of August. And in the meantime, I followed up with 2 infectious disease doctors to make sure that I was on the proper course of treatment. Dr. Phillips will readily affirm that I am hypervigilant by nature. He calls me HV. But I want to point out that I didn't know much about Lyme disease, but my instincts were already telling me something very bad was happening to my body. Both of these ID doctors from New York University confirmed that I was on the best, most aggressive treatment and admonished me to stay off the internet researching tick-borne diseases. And I also thought that was a very strange thing to say. I felt okay when I stopped the meds, but I woke up one day in October and my breast was swollen and extremely painful. My internist examined me. She looked extremely alarmed, And she got the head of Mount Sinai Breast Oncology to squeeze me in. I have a very serious family history of breast cancer, and she understood that this was potentially ominous. He did see me, and he was very puzzled by my symptoms and acknowledged that they were real, but he had no idea what they were, only that they were not cancer. And that was another lesson, that doctors only see what they know. They don't investigate. They don't connect the dots. They don't look at you as a whole person. To him, I was just somebody who didn't have breast cancer, and his job was done. But still, I went back to him 2 more times, given my family history, and I begged him to reevaluate and try to find some reason for my ongoing symptoms. Now I was riddled with extreme panic and anxiety, but not the kind that is related to a situation. I knew something was wrong, but it was like neuropsych. It wasn't normal to be as crazy as I was feeling. He could see it, he just didn't know. He thought maybe I ate too much soy. I don't eat soy. I thought that was pretty stupid. And I just kept asking him why. There has to be a reason. So please, if you remember nothing else from my story, please remember that there is always a reason when your body goes haywire. And I advise anybody who's suddenly or chronically ill to not simply accept autoimmunity as cause without asking many more questions. You have to get to the root. You have to get to the root. Because when you get a diagnosis of fibromyalgia or rheumatoid arthritis or psoriatic arthritis or MS or Alzheimer's or anxiety, OCD, depression, or other mood disorders, ALS, understand that these are only descriptions of your symptoms, but they don't answer the real question. And understand that Lyme and other chronic so-called stealth infections like Bartonella, which is also called cat scratch disease, have been scientifically linked to cases of each of these diagnoses that I just mentioned, as well as a variety of others that are labeled autoimmune, neurodegenerative, neuropsychiatric, and psychiatric conditions. If you're new to this, I realize that you may be thinking that this sounds crazy. How can it possibly be that all these diagnoses are linked to tick-borne diseases? Not everything is Lyme and Bartonella. I agree, not everything is Lyme and Bartonella. There could definitely be another cause, and all causes should be explored and investigated and thoroughly ruled out. However, there is no system of the body that Lyme and Bartonella can't infiltrate and attack, and quite often they are the underlying causes of these diseases. They are. A lot. That's why we're here. So until you have these diseases thoroughly ruled out by an ILADS doctor, they're still on the table as far as I'm concerned. The other hard lesson that I learned was don't trust anybody but a Lyme specialist about Lyme. Not an ID doctor, not your pediatrician, never a rheumatologist. What a sham of a field that is. I could go on and on about that. The blood test produced so many false positives, but he did some blood work, and he sent me home with 3 antibiotic prescriptions and one more memorable piece of advice. Don't go on the internet looking for stories of recovery, because the people that get well don't spend their time on message boards. So in that moment, I swore that if I was lucky enough to get better, I would share my hopeful story with as many people who needed to hear it. Little could I have imagined that this is the turn my life would take. So I flew home to New York. I started my treatment, but I knew in my heart that this California doctor was not the right fit for me. I got a list of specialists from all kinds of foundations, but upon researching, none of them felt right to me either. At this point, I'm only going to trust my gut on everything. I've been right the whole time, and I've been misled. So I just kept putting the word out, and at the last minute, somebody that I met on a plane 7 years ago, who had just bought a house in Vermont, who was very well connected, I had a weird gut instinct to email him and say, I think I'm dying from Lyme. You live in New England. Do you know anybody I could see? And his next door neighbor sent me a beautiful letter about Dr. Phillips, and she had heard him speak here. several years before that and said if anybody in my family was going to have to go down this road and get Lyme treatment, if any of us got Lyme, we would see him. So I went on YouTube that night and I watched one of his terrifying talks, and I freaked out, but I knew that he was the one. The information is so terrifying and sobering. I was lucky enough to get in on a cancellation a few weeks later, and slowly but surely he got me well. So as I got better, my rage skyrocketed. I could not believe the injustice and the denial and the crime being perpetrated in medicine by our own government agencies like the CDC, who deny the global disaster that is tick-borne disease. I decided to do what I know best, and I picked up a pen. And I wrote my story for the Huffington Post, but I really just thought a few dozen people would read it. I could never, ever have imagined what this was to become and the outpouring I was to receive. There were harrowing stories from all over the world, from Ghana, Australia, the UK, Canada, Europe, China, all over the United States. One story worse than the next. People sent me photos of themselves healthy and then in a wheelchair 6 months later. They sent pictures of their children in zombie-like states. They told me they lost their homes, their spouses, their children, their dignity, their ability to walk. They lost their souls. Some went blind. And many said they wished they could die and that they would die rather than lead this broken life. A handsome attorney from the Midwest wrote to me asking for help, saying that he couldn't suffer anymore. I immediately replied with the reassurance that there was hope. I urged him not to give up, and I passed along the name of a wonderful clinician that I just read about near him. 2 weeks later, I learned he committed suicide. My life has been sharply refocused, and my soul has been immensely changed by your stories. I take them so completely to heart, where they have fueled my mission to expose the breathtaking truth of these infections and the organized, concerted effort by mainstream thought leaders to deny it, cover it up, and profit from it. If you want to understand more about the profiting part, I would recommend that you watch the brilliant documentary, Oscar shortlisted documentary, Under Our Skin, and go down the rabbit hole on their website and see the unbelievable freedom of information docs that they've uncovered, the kind of collusion between various, the CDC, NIH, the IDSA, and others. It's really shocked me. So there's no proper test for Lyme. There's no cure. It's a chronic stealth bacteria. They are both Bartonella as well. It's chronic stealth infections that evade standard blood tests and can make your brain, heart, joints, and gut its permanent home. There is so little money to fund this pandemic, which has more sufferers than breast cancer, colon cancer, and HIV combined. The patients are desperately trying to fund it ourselves. Doctors are not trained to recognize Lyme. They don't look for it, yet they confidently dismiss it. You have to ask. They're still going to dismiss it, but you got to ask. They're a dogmatic and largely uncurious bunch. I always call them sheep following the bad CDC guidelines while their patients fall apart before them. Millions around the world are suffering because this truth has been suppressed. Lyme patients are the most disenfranchised, sickest group in medicine, cast aside as if we don't exist. It's a crime that medical students are given 15 minutes of incorrect education on what our friend Neil Spector, Duke oncologist, calls a disease as complicated and virulent as cancer. Speaking of Neil, who I call my earth angel, he is the most magical person. I want to end by telling you a bit about the mission we're on, along with the extraordinary Dr. Stephen Phillips, and how a little serendipity and an inexplicable force brought the three of us together. As I was recovering, I read Neil's gorgeous memoir. It really is the most stunning book I've ever read, and I like to read a lot. Gone in a Heartbeat. I read it in one Sunday afternoon, and it was the first book I was able to read in 13 months due to my cognitive issues from Lyme, and it was really one of the best I've ever read. And I felt compelled, like everybody else who reads his book, the poor guy gets inundated with zillions of emails, I felt compelled to write to him and thank him for his book and for sharing his story and being so honest. And he gave me so much hope. I still was not completely well. And I didn't ask him to reply, and I didn't expect to hear back from him, but I did. A few hours later, I received a beautiful, heartfelt letter from him, and I was walking down 3rd Avenue and heard my phone go off, and I just burst into tears when I read it. I just was so touched. I'll never forget it. And we corresponded back and forth, and we became friends. And it quickly became apparent to me that he had to meet Dr. Phillips. I just knew that the power of their minds coming together could change this stagnant landscape. So getting the 2 of the most in-demand doctors from different states in the same room was not going to be easy, but I was quite determined, or you would call me relentless, Steve. So Neil was coming to New York City, and I got Steve to agree to come to dinner with us, and it was there that you shared your idea for a potential cure for Bartonella, and Neil said, wow, I'd love to bring you guys to Duke and present this to my lab of immunology and oncology PhDs and see if they think this could be as game-changing as I do. And here we are, the rest is history. We formed a company around it, and with the help of Lyme Connection, we've been raising money, and we're so thrilled to tell you we were just awarded the Bay Area Lyme Foundation's $100,000 Emerging Leader Award grant. Dr. Phillips received that just over the weekend. It's going to fund our first in vitro study, and we will proudly be partnering with Ed Breitschwart and his team at Galaxy. I'll let Dr. Phillips elaborate more on the research. As far as my role goes, I call myself a Dr. Wrangler. They call me the nucleus, which is really disgusting but awesome. I had to Google it after you said it. I was like, oh, all right, that's what I am now. In the midst of all of this, Dr. Phillips and I were approached by an agent to write a book together, and we signed a major book deal just last week. You're the first to know. So we're excited to be hopefully doing our parts to move this conversation forward, just like our friend Lew Leone and just like all of you here and Lyme Connection. So I wanted to just end by saying, I am okay. I am better. I am a hopeful story. So if you have horrible days, please remember me, and please know that I was hopeless and lying in bed and couldn't breathe 3 years ago and thought I was dead and writing goodbye letters to my loved ones. I think the tides are changing. I think there's hope on the horizon. Please don't give up, and we're not going to stop fighting for you. In the meantime, thank you. Just kidding. I have to introduce my partner in crime. Stephen Phillips is, the most brilliant person that Lew and I know for sure. And I don't know how many of you know like lots and lots of rocket scientists. I don't. Steve is a genius, and he's one of the most caring and thoughtful clinicians. He went to Yale. He's treated 20,000 or more patients over the last 22 years, and now it's such a thrill to be able to introduce him to you and to be moving forward together in the world and in this research. So please welcome Dr. Stephen Phillips.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. I know the roads were closed. I have a blackout in my house for the past couple of days. I know it was hard to get here for some folks. Today we're going to be given a kind of a different presentation, a little less formal. Dana has told me that medical conferences are boring, which is kind of true. And so instead of doing a PowerPoint presentation, I'll just be going through starting with the basics of Lyme and these other associated infections and getting more advanced as we go along. So I used to think I knew what Lyme disease was until I realized that I didn't have a clue what Lyme disease is. And what we really see as clinicians is a soup of infections. It's very rare that you get single-agent Lyme bacteria as the cause of a patient's illness. And that's been a slow realization over the years. And it's not just Lyme disease. Okay, so is that better? Okay. So Lyme bacteria are Borrelia burgdorferi, and there are about 300 different strains of the bacteria that cause Lyme disease. But there are other Borrelia which are not Lyme, and these are called non-Lyme Borrelia. And we don't have tests for them. There's a test for one of them called Borrelia miyamotoi, but there are many others that we don't have tests for. and they keep finding new ones all over the world. There's a major epidemic of a Lyme-like illness in Brazil. There's a Lyme-like illness in the south caused by Borrelia lone stari. No test exists. So there was a doctor, may he rest in peace, Ed Masters, who was reporting hundreds of cases of Lyme disease to the CDC in Missouri, and people were getting tick bites and rashes and typical Lyme symptoms. They were responding to antibiotics, and they would always test negative. And it's caused by this other Borrelia, so another bacteria, very close cousin to Lyme, but not Lyme. And Borrelia miyamotoi, which is one of the cousins to Lyme, is almost as common as Lyme in Connecticut, believe it or not. So it's 40% as common as Lyme is. So it's really not an improbable thing to get infected with Borrelia miyamotoi. Does anybody mind if I take my jacket off? We'll do a little striptease. It's so warm up here. So, but, and I think that the two the two classes of bacteria that are most likely to cause chronic infection are the spirochetes, Borrelia, and Bartonella. And Bartonella is not a spirochete. It produces many of the same symptoms as Lyme, and it's easily confused with Lyme. And recent studies show that 2/3 of patients diagnosed with chronic Lyme actually have co-infection with Bartonella. It's a hugely important infection. It's inherently antibiotic resistant, and it's underdiagnosed, undertreated, and completely misunderstood by the medical community. Bartonella is thought to be a self-limited illness. Cat scratch fever is usually viewed as a self-limited illness. The fact is that it can be, and in many cases it's not, and it's very tightly linked to a range of autoimmune conditions. So if we start with just plain old Lyme, people always ask how common is the rash? The rash is overestimated in most kind of recent studies because it's a skewed statistic. The rash is part of the reporting criteria for the CDC. So if it's part of the reporting criteria, many studies, the patients get diagnosed by reporting criteria. So it's this kind of circular reasoning. They get diagnosed by the presence of the rash, and then they conclude that the rash is present in 90% of the cases. Meanwhile, that's how they diagnose the patients to begin with. So the most accurate data is from Steer's, Dr. Steer's own data from the 70s, where the rash was not part of the CDC case definition. And in those cases, he found that 25% of patients with Lyme had a history of a prior rash. And that's pretty much what I see in my practice. People ask, what are the symptoms of Lyme? Well, Lyme can have no symptoms. It could be completely asymptomatic, and it could be rapidly fatal. And both of these instances have been reported. So you say, how common is it for it to have asymptomatic Lyme bacteria in your body? It's actually pretty common. So the Lyme vaccine, I believe, was a miserable vaccine, and they took it off the market. But during its study, the stuff that they were doing to bring it to market, they did a large evaluation, and they had a control group. And in the control group, 11% of the people turned positive by CDC criteria for Lyme. And so 11% were turning positive. They were asymptomatic, and that was in an area of New England. The CDC criteria for diagnosing Lyme is this very strict criteria that many people with Lyme don't actually meet. So if 11% were turning positive, you say, what percentage of Lyme patients does the CDC criteria actually capture? As per the CDC, it only captures 10%. So if you do the math, and 11% tested positive by CDC criteria, it implies that roughly the whole population is walking around infected with Lyme bacteria, if you extrapolate. And that could be either really comforting or really scary, depending on how you view this thing. I think that the paradigm of these infections is really just completely upside down, that these are common infections, that most people fight them off fairly effectively, and some don't. And the people that don't become very, very ill, and many of them can become disabled. So you can't have a one-size-fits-all kind of mentality when it comes to these illnesses, because each person is unique. We have a unique set of immune system parameters. We have a tremendous amount of strain heterogeneity, and we have the specter of multiple co-infections. So to treat Lyme as if it's just one unified entity it's just wrong. It's wrong, and it's ineffective, and it leads to poor treatment outcomes. So So you say, okay, Dana had touched upon the study that was done by Danbury Hospital where they treated patients with doxycycline, a standard course, and showed a 61% failure rate. That's pretty terrible statistics. And the Hopkins study showed 39%. There are multiple studies showing that when people are treated with at the stage of a Lyme rash with a standard course of doxycycline for 3 to 4 weeks, they have in excess of a 20% failure rate. So just to be conservative and not ruffle too many feathers, I usually quote 20% plus. But when I treat Lyme rashes, I don't use doxycycline in isolation. I give patients a combination of high-dose doxycycline plus Zithromax, and I do that for a month, and then I have them go off and do rounds of sequential antibiotics after that, because I'm looking to lower these relapse rates. And with these protocols that I have, I don't see much acute Lyme or acute disseminated Lyme anymore. My personal practice is closed, but I have a couple of nurse practitioners that are accepting new patients, and the waiting list was 2 years long. So on the Saturdays, and I would come in and see patients with Lyme rashes because I didn't want anybody to develop chronic Lyme. And I remember that a guy came in with a tick bite on one of these Saturdays, and he had no symptoms. We went down the whole symptom list, and I checked the Lyme Western blot at a local lab, and he had 4 bands on his Western blot. And I called him up saying, look, I know you don't have any symptoms, but 4 bands on a Western blot, you got a tick bite a few days ago. There's no time to develop these bands. I think you've been asymptomatically infected with Lyme. Why don't we extend your treatment a little bit longer, and I'll see you in about 6 weeks. And we did, and he comes back, he's like, wow, I'm so much better after the antibiotics. Thank you. You changed my life. I'm like, you didn't have any symptoms. How could you change your life? You were fine. He's like, no, I thought when you're 52, it's normal to be tired after work and be achy in the morning. And what do you really call that? You know, it's a case of minimally symptomatic Lyme, which the guy attributed to normal aging. And if he never would have come to see me, he probably would have been fine, or maybe not. You know, there's data out of Harvard and other places that, you know, kind of long-term, kind of chronic indolent infections like this can be associated with development of neurodegenerative illness like dementias. So Harvard did a study not too long ago where they took a bacteria, put it in the brains of mice, and the mice responded by forming amyloid, which is the protein associated with Alzheimer's. And the amyloid is actually an antimicrobial peptide, and it surrounded the bacteria and stopped it from spreading. So it's actually a defense mechanism. So when mice without the ability to get amyloid get a central nervous system infection, they die rapidly. So it's interesting. It seems like, you know, the stuff that protects us in youth, it could be detrimental in old age. And Mother Nature doesn't really care what happens to people once they are old enough to have babies. And amyloid, like I said, is this protein that's associated with Alzheimer's. So, the other questions I get are IV antibiotics better than oral antibiotics? They've done a couple of studies showing that IV antibiotics are not superior with Lyme to oral antibiotics. They've looked at acute disseminated Lyme and late-stage Lyme. I used to use IV antibiotics when I first opened, and then I stopped because I didn't find that it was definitely superior across the board. I think that some patients can respond better to IV antibiotics. I definitely have seen folks, but you can't predict. And we do know that they're more dangerous going in. So that's why in my practice we don't use IV antibiotics. We use complex regimens of oral antibiotics, and we use them in a pulsed fashion, which I'll get to. So I should talk about the controversy between IDSA and ILADS. IDSA stands for Infectious Disease Society of America. It's a medical society that deals with a multitude of infectious diseases, obviously. And ILADS is the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society, and they focus on vector-borne illnesses like Lyme, Bartonella, Babesia, and Anaplasma. And they have really divergent views. IDSA says basically you have to meet CDC criteria to get a diagnosis of Lyme, and that a short course of antibiotics will cure it. And ILAD says, no, that's not necessarily true, that people with Lyme can have negative tests, and that a short course of antibiotics doesn't always cure it. And then you say, okay, well, what does the data show? Well, the data shows that Lyme tests, like I said, the CDC criteria only captures 10% of Lyme cases as per CDC itself. The data also shows that chronic infection can follow antibiotics, not just short-term antibiotics, even long-term antibiotics. So Lyme bacteria are, unfortunately, they're really fastidious. They're very, very hard to grow from animals and people who have chronic infection. So if you inject an animal with Lyme bacteria, then wait, let the animal get sick, don't treat the animal with anything, and try to grow the bacteria from the animal's blood, nothing grows. Looks like the blood is sterile. So if you can't prove that it's there before you treat, how can you claim that it's gone after you treat? Because there's no before and after. So the animal studies, we have the advantage they cut the little animals up and they show that it's still there. So they can find it in tissues pretty easily, and it's relatively difficult to find in the fluids. So with these animal studies, they've shown very clearly that with doxycycline, with Rocephin, with these standard treatments that the IDSA says cures Lyme disease, the animals are not cured. They've done rodent studies, dog studies, horse studies, and monkey studies. And the latest monkey study was just published by Tulane a few months ago, and the cure rate with doxycycline was 0%. So, you know, it's, we have to go into this thinking, wait a second, how close of a model are monkeys to humans? They're extremely close. And they say, what does the human data show? The human data, you know, we don't cut the people up. That's the main difference between the animal studies. The human data is people have gone for surgeries mainly, so it's relatively less than what we'd hoped for. But that relatively less, it still amounts to about 30 studies representing about 75 patients. And the longest on record where they've proven chronic Lyme despite antibiotics is in a patient who was treated with roughly 2 years of antibiotics, about a year of which was IV and a year of which was oral. And then she ultimately went in for knee surgery, and they grew Lyme bacteria alive from her knee joint. You know, if you prove that there's such a thing as, you know, one white crow, then you know that not all crows are black. So if you prove that you can isolate Lyme bacteria from a patient after 2 years of antibiotics, you've thus proven that antibiotics are not necessarily curative for this infection. The same thing has been done for Bartonella. Bartonella, unlike Lyme, is intrinsically antibiotic resistant. Lyme is intrinsically antibiotic persistent, and there's a difference. You say, what's the difference? Antibiotic resistance is the ability to actively grow in the face of the antibiotic. It's called in log phase. Antibiotic persistence is a way to kind of go into the semi-hibernation state, have these altered forms. They're called biofilms, and they call them persisters now to encompass all the different forms that these bacteria can take. But basically, the antibiotics will kill some of them, and the others go into this persister state, and then you can't kill them with the antibiotics. So Johns Hopkins, Tulane, Northeastern, there are many studies now in the last 3 and 4 years showing that turns out you can't kill Lyme in the test tube with doxycycline. So Dana's statement of that ID doctor that said doxycycline kills Lyme 100%, it's actually not true. Lyme is not killed by doxycycline in the test tube. It's not killed by ceftriaxone, Rocephin. It's not killed by amoxicillin, and it's not killed by Ceftin. And these are the only 4 drugs which are canonized by the IDSA as the cures for Lyme. And none of them will kill it in the test tube. So if it's not killing it in the test tube, what are the chances that it's going to eradicate it in the body? Do you know the NIH did a study of chronic Lyme, well, they didn't call it chronic Lyme, but they did a study of post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, which is what they call it, and they put uninfected ticks on these patients to see what happens, and ticks got infected from feeding on the patient's blood, and these are the patients that they termed having post-Lyme. Post-Lyme, though, is this kind of, I think, idiotic fabrication. You know, you just draw a line in the sand at some point and say, well, you took the medicine that we say is the cure, and therefore it's a post-infectious syndrome. But they don't say that for cancer. You know, they don't say it for HIV. They don't say it for other kind of diseases that are hard to eradicate. They don't say you have post-cancer syndrome. So it's kind of a slap in the face, and it's insulting. And I would echo, you know, Dana's comments about you have to follow your gut. And if a doctor's not making sense, you really have to find a doctor who does make sense. And, you know, we've all been failed by the medical community, unfortunately, my family included. My dad had an undiagnosed case of Lyme for many years, and he had dilated cardiomyopathy. You say, what is that? That's a swelling, a progressive swelling of the heart All 4 chambers of his heart were dilated. It's the same type of heart failure that requires heart transplant that Dr. Spector went through. And so we connected immediately on many levels because of my dad's situation and his situation. And my father's case was missed by the best doctors in New York City as well. We don't skimp on doctors, lawyers, or accountants in my family, and we went to the best and the heads of the major teaching hospitals, and none of them diagnosed him with Lyme, and I had to do it. And I was, learning a bit more about Lyme, and I thought, let's check him. And the antibody test was negative. He had 1 band on the Western blot, band 41, which is like the least specific band. And it's a risk-benefit ratio in medicine, just like it is in all aspects of life. If someone's seriously ill and the treatment's relatively benign, which it is in the case of doxycycline, it's worth treating. But I brought it up to his doctors, and they wouldn't do it, so I had to do it myself. And he had a Herxheimer reaction. People say, what's a Herxheimer reaction? A Herxheimer reaction is a worsening of the underlying symptoms when you treat. And, this classic definition of a Herxheimer is a bit off, unfortunately. They've, historically defined it as a die-off reaction, but people with Lyme can have Herxheimer's that last a very long time and don't get better for months sometimes, or they could have multiple Herxheimer's. If it's dying off, how can somebody have 20 Herxheimer's? Isn't it dead already? I mean, how many times can something die? So the definition of a Herxheimer is incorrect. It's a mixture of some bacterial killing and some blebbing, which is shedding of the bacterial membranes in response to stress. And these blebs are little like microbial dandruff, like decoys, and they float around, and they confuse the immune system. The immune system goes after these blebs thinking they're whole bacteria, and it's one of the many evolutionary tricks that this bacteria has to evade the immune response and make us sicker. The net result, though, of these blebs is they are intrinsic to autoimmune illness. They incorporate themselves inside white blood cells. The white blood cells now become targets of the immune system, and it sets up a cascade of autoimmunity. So in my dad's case, he did respond, thank goodness, to antibiotic therapy. His heart function normalized by the end of a year, and he never needed a heart transplant. And he stayed on antibiotics for a few years, and he's 85 now. And so, yeah. I'm just getting emotional because he's got dementia now. So the question is dementia related to his illness? I think possibly. So they've done a study. They did a study with dilated cardiomyopathy recently, in 2015. And they showed in 110 patients with dilated cardiomyopathy that they went in and actually did heart muscle biopsies of these patients to try and diagnose Lyme. And they found it in 20%. And they made a point to say in the study, 64% of them are negative Lyme tests. Who's going to go and get a heart muscle biopsy to diagnose their Lyme? If you don't have a high index of suspicion for these cases, how are you going to diagnose a patient waiting for a heart transplant? So in terms of disease states related to these infections, in my practice I see a tremendous amount of patients diagnosed with autoimmune conditions on a regular basis. And people come in with diagnoses, for example, of rheumatoid arthritis. This is one of the most common diagnoses I see. And you say, well, what's the data correlating RA to infection? Critics of these studies may say, well, they're responding to the anti-inflammatory effect of the antibiotics, which is not true. They've used antibiotics that have an anti-inflammatory effect, and they've used antibiotics without an anti-inflammatory effect. So they've also had patients failing steroids and methotrexate, which basically obliterate the immune system, and the antibiotics still work when those powerful immunosuppressants fail. So there is no valid reason to say that these antibiotics are working apart from the antimicrobial effect. But the only thing that's publicized are immune suppressants for RA, because immune suppressants are very, very profitable. And they're an annuity. They're a long-term deal. Nobody gets off immune suppressants. For example, with Remicade, the relapse rates, if someone goes on 3 years of Remicade and then goes off, the published relapse rates are 97%. So, the relapse rates for a short course of antibiotics are high, but the relapse rates that I see in my practice for a full treatment course, which in my practice on average is 6 to 9 months of antibiotics over 10 to 14 months of time, I don't have a 97% relapse rate. I have a 3% relapse rate. So we have a 97% non-relapse rate. So You say, why am I doing 6 to 9 months of antibiotics over 10 to 14 months of time? It's pulse therapy is something that I started doing around 2002. I opened in 96, and I was treating like the other Lyme doctors. And my treatment regimens were, on average, I was treating patients for like 4 years. And I was just looking around for a better way. And I had compound pulse therapy. I read a couple of case reports, and it seemed at first counterintuitive. And but then I was like, wait a second, maybe there's some type of form these bacteria enter into, and you take the antibiotics away, and they come out of the hiding places, and you whack them, and you do it a few times. And sure enough, that's exactly what Northeastern showed that when you do intermittent courses of Rocephin, you can eradicate Lyme in the test tube. If you do one continuous course, you can't. So the mechanism for pulse therapy has been justified in the test tube. And I find that pulsing usually works better. But like I said, you can't cookbook these things. You have to individualize to every patient. Some patients have to be treated with long courses of antibiotics. And even though my average is 10 to 14 months of time, I have some patients that I'm treating for years, And excuse me. So getting back to the autoimmune conditions associated with these illnesses, they're robust. It's not just the data with rheumatoid arthritis. There's tons of data with psoriasis showing that psoriasis responds to Bactrim and rifampin and tetracycline class antibiotics. I remember one of my first cases of a patient that I saw with really a horrible case of psoriasis. He had psoriasis since he was a teenager, and no Lyme symptoms, no illness, just psoriasis. And then a couple of years before we saw him, he came down with arthritis all over, headaches, fatigue, the whole bit. And I treated him for his Lyme, and his psoriasis never budged. And we were going through the paces of what to treat him with, and we kind of cycled through, and I had tried a drug called Bactrim, which is a sulfa drug, which has a lot of allergies associated with it. But in patients that can tolerate it, it can be helpful. And his psoriasis magically disappeared, basically 100%. And I brought him in, and we started talking about when the psoriasis began, and it turns out it began a few weeks after he had a family reunion. I said, where was your family reunion? He said that they had it in Pennsylvania, and it was a hunting trip, and they rented a cabin, and his job was to skin the deers. And that's when it all started for him. So I started thinking, holy crap, are some of these autoimmune conditions really caused by infection that's indolent, undiagnosed, and sometimes difficult to treat? So, we kind of put 2 and 2 together. And there's an autoimmune condition called Wegener's, which is a granulomatous condition. Granuloma are the analogous situation for slow-growing, fastidious bacteria to abscesses are for fast-growing regular bacteria. When you think of bacteria, we should always divide it into the rapidly growing, relatively recent, on an evolutionary scale, bacteria that doctors do understand, like E. coli, strep, staph, etc. And the zoonotic, meaning from animals to people, slow-growing fastidious bacteria that doctors don't have a clue about. And, Lyme is one of the oldest bacteria on the planet. Spirochetes are ancient. They have documented Lyme spirochetes, or the granddaddy of Lyme spirochetes, in a tick encased in amber in the belly of the tick from 15 million years ago. So these have been around for a very, very long time. And, autoimmune disease in general was described way before Lyme was known to be a thing. So there's a lot of inertia there. There's a lot of dogma. And believe me when I tell you it's dogma. I've been telling, Dana gets her distaste of rheumatology from me, I think, because of my distaste for rheumatology. I just think it's a field that just has to go away because they don't know what causes anything. The treatments that are used are very toxic drugs, and they cure nothing, ever. So if you can take some of these potential bacterial causes of autoimmune conditions and nip it in the bud, that's what we aim to do. So let's talk a little bit about the hopeful aspects. Oh, I forgot to mention the relationship to multiple sclerosis, because we should definitely talk about that, because it's a relatively common condition, and people ask about it all the time. Like I said, there are many, many disease states related to, potentially related to indolent infection, and MS has been one of the best documented. And, you know, back in the 50s, they had found spirochetes in the brains of MS patients, and they actually put a name to it. They call it Spirocheta myeloflora, which means myelin destroyer. So it turns out on the surface of Lyme, there's a protein that looks almost identical immunologically to myelin, which is the lining of nerve cells, the insulation. So when the immune system recognizes Lyme bacteria, recognizes this protein and causes a cross reaction with the myelin. So it develops an anti-myelin response. And they were suspecting that this is a spirochetal infection in the 50s. And then they had done these studies with baby animals where they took, you know, spinal fluid and brain tissue from MS patients and put them into baby animals, and they got a progressive neurologic illness. And then immunosuppressants came on the scene, and it was kind of a quick fix, so they went down that path instead. But there's a lot of data linking Lyme to MS, and there are 3 studies treating MS with antibiotics and showed that minocycline gives benefit to MS patients in terms of the MRI scans, in terms of the relapses, even when standard MS treatments are failing, and that's been published. But nobody talks about these things really, they just push the standard MS treatments. So, the research that we're doing, yeah, I came upon an idea for a drug designed for Bartonella, and it'll hit Lyme also. But it's designed from the ground up to work against Bartonella, which I view as like the enemy. And like I said, Bartonella is an inherently drug-resistant bacterium. There's only one known class of antibiotic that actually kills it in the test tube, and that antibiotic is fraught with problems. It's highly toxic, does not penetrate the brain, doesn't get in cells. All these things that Bartonella does, this antibiotic doesn't do. So we have basically no definitive cure for Bartonella. And the other aspect of these things is that both Lyme and Bartonella will turn off the immune response against the infection. It's called anergy, like energy with an A, and it stops the immune system from going after it. And chronic infections tend to do this. So this is a huge issue. If you can't have the immune system eradicate the bacteria, and you do have an antibiotic that's very effective and you kill 90%, then that 10% will just grow back as soon as you stop the antibiotic. It's analogous to the situation with AIDS patients where they would get a fungal infection, and you had to keep them on antifungals their whole life at that point, before the new drugs came out. So, so we just got awarded that Emerging Leader Award, you know, from Bay Area Lyme Foundation. They're an amazing organization. They fund really innovative research that's really goal-directed toward cures. I would highly recommend that you guys support them any way you can. And 100% of that money is going to go directly toward the development of this drug. We're in partnership with Ed Breitschwert and his team from Galaxy and NC State. We've interviewed people from everywhere, and we found that they were the most intelligent, most capable team that we found. And Ed Breitschwert is, you know, a legendary resource in the field of Bartonella. He's incredibly well-versed in this field. And we're going to show in a cell culture model, hopefully, that our drug eradicates Bartonella and Lyme from within white blood cells. Because once these bacteria get inside cells, they change, and the antibiotics really can't get to them in the way that they need to. Even antibiotics that get inside cells, like doxycycline gets inside cells, why isn't it killing, you know, Bartonella inside a cell? Turns out that doxycycline is a bacteriostatic drug for Bartonella. It won't kill it even outside of a cell, so the fact that it gets inside doesn't matter. So we have a novel drug delivery system that will kind of inject the bacteria inside the cells, and then phase 2 of the in vitro study that we plan, hopefully knock wood, phase 1 works, should show that the adjuvants don't interfere with the antibacterial activity of the drug. So basically it's a 2-step process. One is antibiotic, powerful new antibiotic with a novel delivery system, and the second phase is an adjuvant to fix the broken immune response. And I'm hoping that between those 2 things, we can come as close to a cure as we can for these infections. In terms of Dr. Spector's research that we're also involved with, That is called, it's called purenomics. It's a subtype of proteomics, and it's similar way that that drug Harvoni for hepatitis C was found that way, and it's a knockout for hepatitis C. There are these targets. Once you have the genes of these bacteria, you can figure out a way to disable them. And it's basically like you're sifting for gold. You know, you have these molecular ways of sifting out what binds the DNA. You do it in it's called a high throughput way, so it's very efficient. And you get all these targets. We already have over 100 targets of potential knockout drugs. And it's a well-funded study, and it's progressing really, really well. And then Dana lastly mentioned the book. So the book is going to chronicle kind of our journeys in this and give people a toolkit on how to get through these illnesses and come out the other side and hopefully be the better for it. So thank you very much for your attention. So Hopkins did a study that Johns Hopkins that oiled oregano for Lyme was actually the strongest thing that they ever found in the test tube against the bacteria. And I prescribe it liposomally in my practice. And liposome is when it's wrapped up in a membrane, so it's microscopic, has a membrane around it, and then the white blood cells now think it's a bacteria, and they eat it up, get confused, so it gets targeted right inside the white blood cells. It's very powerful. It's one of my favorite treatments, actually. So we combine herbals and antibiotics in my practice. I really think that the people that have the best outcomes are open-minded to all that's out there, you know. Of course, I have some patients that only want herbals, and we're limited in that way. Artemisinin is another herbal. It's over the counter that Hopkinton makes liposomally, and that's very powerful. We use a lot of monolaurin. Monolaurin is it's a derivative of coconut oil, and it was published to kill Lyme in the test tube. And it's one of the only things that disrupts and destroys these biofilms, which is the jelly in between the bacteria that accounts for some of its antibiotic persistent aspects. When bacteria inside biofilms, they're 10,000 times more resistant to antibiotics than they are when they're by themselves. So the biofilms are really critical to disrupt if you want to get rid of the infection.
So antifungal medicine, does that help that biofilm to break through it?
I don't think antifungals disrupt biofilms, and not that I know that it's proven, but I use diflucan quite a bit in my practice too. Diflucan was published initially by Dr. Schart in Germany, and he had published a study of 12 patients with persistent Lyme that couldn't get better, who all failed IV antibiotics, and they got better with diflucan. And then nobody did anything in the study, and then Hopkins showed in the test tube that diflucan directly had activity against Lyme and killed it. So even though it's an antifungal, it has activity against this organism, which is a bacteria. So, you know, there's a lot of things that are non-antibiotic antimicrobials that can be used. It's not just about antibiotics. Like, I'm very cognizant of the microbiome. You want everybody to have a healthy GI flora. And we focus on antibiotics that have the lowest risk of flora disruption. We have, like, you know, basically almost a zero C. diff rate in my practice. I had one case, C. diff is Clostridium difficile colitis, which is a serious potential side effect of antibiotics. It's when you kill the bad bacteria, and then the C. diff, which is, you kill a good bacteria, and then the C. diff grows. And you know, some antibiotics have a high risk of C. diff, and others have a low risk. And tetracycline class antibiotics have a super low risk, and things like cephalosporins are very high risk. So,
Are you in open practice?
my nurse practitioners are taking patients. Yeah.
Do you think chronic fatigue syndrome is Lyme?
I think, well, the studies have shown that chronic fatigue syndrome is really a heterogeneous group of disorders. You know, I've seen patients with Lyme diagnosed as chronic fatigue. I've seen patients with Bartonella chronically diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and I've seen some Babesia patients diagnosed with chronic fatigue. Most Babesia patients don't have single-agent Babesia, though. They usually have one of the two, either Lyme or Bartonella. So I think it's a soup.
Okay.
One of the problems, doctor, is that insurance, we can't find doctors that will take insurance, and that's a big setback for us.
I know, I hear you. None of the Lyme doctors really take insurance. People always ask, why is that the case? It's not doable financially. So we book, for my new patients, it's 2 hours, and I usually go over. I just usually don't have lunch. I'll have some almonds or something, and that's it. So it's usually 2.5 that it comes out to be. The follow-ups are half hour, and it goes to 40 minutes. And I know when I go to my doctor, I get 5-10 minutes. I had an ear doctor I went to once, and it was like he was on roller skates. I mean, he went through in like 5 seconds. And I know that visit was probably, my insurance probably billed like $220, you know, so it's unfortunate that it comes down to that, but that's the time aspect. The patients are so complicated. I mean, I had a patient once, just 3 years ago, wheel in, the records were on one of those hand trucks. It was like 5 boxes, and I looked like, and he's like, oh, I'm sorry to overwhelm you. He's like, no, I'm not overwhelmed. I said, he's like, good, I'll get the other truck out of the car. And it took me over a week, no exaggeration, to get through the records. He had spent $750,000 out of pocket going through the Mass General system, and most of it was covered by insurance, so you gotta imagine $750,000 out of pocket. And it turns out he didn't have Lyme, I don't think. He had Charcot-Marie tooth, a variant of Charcot-Marie tooth, which is a congenital, genetic, neurologic disorder, progressive neurologic disorder. Very bizarre.
A lot of questions. Who do you recommend to a person, or what do you recommend by a person who was bitten and infected by a tick last week who visited the emergency room yesterday with chest and arm pain?
Well,
Yeah, so, okay, so can I, do you have a mic that works? That's hot? Okay, that would be great. Okay. Hello? All right, here we go. Who do you recommend, or what do you recommend to someone infected by a tick last week? This person visited the emergency room yesterday with chest and arm pain.
so I'm not sure of the question, if the person has a diagnosis of Lyme and is currently under treatment? No, the person just got a tick bite and doesn't have a diagnosis of Lyme?
He got a tick bite last week, and he's 58, he had like a squeezing sensation in his arm,
Yeah.
and chest pain yesterday, so he was in the ER.
Right.
And they said they didn't know what it was.
Right, so my assumption is, obviously the person has to get ruled out for a heart attack.
He did.
Yeah. You know, and a 58-year-old man, you know, and I treat tick bites personally. In my practice, I treat tick bites. I figure the risk of not treating a tick bite is just too great. You know, I give people doxycycline at the time of the tick bite, and it's usually fine. But I would follow up very strongly with the cardiac route, and I would follow up very strongly with the ID route. You know, looking for tick-borne illness. Both. Like, you never want to be in the position of saying, oh, it's Lyme, and you miss a heart attack. You know, it's like the worst thing ever. So both of them have to be followed up very strongly, I think.
How would you rule out the Lyme in that case?
How would you rule out Lyme?
Yes.
It's sometimes difficult to do. I mean, Lyme usually doesn't present as symptoms compatible with heart attack. I've seen it. I had a patient I remember from Martha's Vineyard who was airlifted by helicopter 3 or 4 times with crushing chest pain to Massachusetts General Hospital, and he was presenting as heart disease each time, and it turned out to be Lyme. But you know, you do it in the typical ways. You do a full clinical assessment, go down. We have a large symptom list. And Lyme typically presents as a multi-system illness. People will get neurologic, cardiac, musculoskeletal, constitutional. So for neurologic, you'll look for headaches, sensitivity to light in your eyes, stiff neck, problem sleeping. People don't realize that sleep disorder is a neurologic symptom. It's part of encephalopathy. And obviously cognitive problems and foggy feelings in their head. And for cardiac, it could be anything, not just chest pain is relatively rare, but it's relatively common to have heart palpitations and such. And obviously the musculoskeletal symptoms and the constitutional symptoms would be like fatigue and fevers and chills.
What's the hopeful timeline for the BART drug development?
Yeah, so the timeline for testing it in the cell culture study is only 3 months. So I'm hoping that we'll start in July. We should have some information by October, and that will prove or not prove the core concept of my idea. And if the core concept is proved, that even if the adjuvant doesn't work, the part to fix the immune response, as long as you show that it doesn't interfere with the activity of the drug, we're going to go to animal studies. And that would take, you know, 6 to 9 months probably. The problem is funding. You know, all these things are enormously expensive, and you know, that's the problem. We have to. It doesn't take so long to do the study. It takes a long time to do the grant that I submitted to the Bay Area Lyme Foundation was 40 pages long. I've never written a grant before. You know, I mean, you know, I have a job as a doctor to try and write the grant. It was hard. So we're going to hire a grant writer at some point to help us out because we need it. And hopefully next one will be
Any
smooth.
takers?
Where do we donate?
Crash test.
Lyme Connection.
Through Lyme Connection, actually, on their website, and you can write it off. That's the awesome
it's tax deductible.
part about donating through them, is you can write it off, and they give it all to our research in these studies.
Dana, did I hear you correctly before when you said there's more people walking around with Lyme disease than breast cancer or something else?
Yes.
Lyme?
Yes.
HIV and breast cancer.
HIV, colon, and breast cancer.
So there's 329,000 cases per year. At least 20% become chronic. That's a conservative number. So you're looking,
329,000 is also vastly underestimated. Now they're saying, even the stupid CDC is saying it's like 10 times more. It was, on the front page of the New York Times.
and it's not just the United States. So I gave I did speaking tours in Europe in 2015 and 2016. I couldn't, guy comes up to me in Norway. He said, we made 3 appointments in your office, and my wife is too sick to get on the plane. And when I got back to the States, they made another appointment, and I couldn't accept him as a patient because I know I would see her one time and not be able to provide adequate care, and she'd never be able to come back, and I wouldn't be able to intervene if something hit the fan in Norway. It's a tragic situation. There are no treating doctors in Scandinavia. It's a socialized medical system. They have among the highest rates of tick-borne illness in the world, and it's present on basically every continent. It's not an exaggeration. This is a global, it's a pandemic for sure.
What's your opinion about going on a gluten-free, sugar-free, dairy-free diet as part of Lyme? I mean, it helped me. I'll certainly want Dr. Phillips to weigh in, but it helped me so much with my pain before I even took my first antibiotic. A Lyme patient, a friend of a friend, called me up. I thought at the time she was so mean because she was so aggressive with me, but I'm now her. I'm sure people think I'm mean all the time, so I'm like, you have to do what I'm saying. Stop questioning me and don't listen to your dumb doctor. But she basically said to me, if you don't eat paleo, don't ever ask me for any more help the rest of your treatment. She basically said that, and by the way, I thought she was right, because within a week, my pain was down 50 to 70%, and I had a lot of other stuff. Dr. Phillips got me better the other part of my journey, but it was important for me. What do you think?
I think that having these types of anti-inflammatory diets can be beneficial. It can control symptoms. I'm not convinced that it changes the net outcome in the end, but in some people, it doesn't help them. So for people who've tried paleo and they say, I'm on this restricted diet, I feel no better, I'm like, have your pizza. I mean, life is short and you should enjoy it. So I'm not like the paleo Nazi, I'm in between. I think that use common sense like everything else.
What do you suggest for people who are having a bad herx?
Well, when people are having a herxemia that's too severe, we recommend actually stopping the antibiotics and doing whatever measures that are helpful. People talk about detox a lot of times. It's a commonly used term. It's not so much of a medical term. It's more kind of an alternative term, and people do different things. Some people do different herbals like berber and panela and parsley. I actually find some old school remedies to be helpful, like Epsom salt baths, and some patients will tell me that, water with lemon is helpful. I mean, whatever you find is helpful to you, whether it's relaxing massage or soak in a tub, whatever. I just think you have to enhance the relaxation response to get through these things. And also, some aspirin and other anti-inflammatories could be helpful.
Reiki's good. Neil Spector does a lot of Reiki. I think it's super good for your nervous system. Just calm things down because it's Reiki, R-E-I-K-I. It's just like a good healing, calming energy.
And again, with Reiki, I'm not saying for sure, I'm not anti-Reiki, I'm not pro. I'm not 100% convinced that there's energy coming out of the Reiki practitioner's hands. But but I'm not 100. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying, but it is a relaxation, experience, and I think that that's beneficial. So I had a patient who I've seen around town, and he calls all the time to tell me how well he is. He's been well over a year, and when he was getting better, he started doing massages, and he kept up his massages after he's off antibiotics because it's part of his relaxation kind of experience, and it's helpful for him. And I do think it's probably part of what how he's still well.
I have a question for Lew Leone here. Why Thank God. Why is Lyme and tick-borne disease barely mentioned by mainstream media? Ooh. Good
Well,
luck.
it's actually getting more coverage in mainstream media, and my cohort at WNBC, Channel 4 in New York, they did a whole week on Lyme disease, and the reason I found out because she was featured in the story, his daughter, 13-year-old daughter, had a severe case of Lyme, had to drop out of school, so people with Lyme say you don't get it until you get it, right? So his daughter got it, and he got it, my wife got it, and I got it. And it's being picked up more and more by mainstream media. And the media, they like to scare people, like you say, storm of the century. We like things, here you have a bad thing, which are the ticks. It's a bad illness. The controversy scares some people between the IDSA and what Dr. Phillips talked about and ILADS. This controversy definitely scares some media people away. They don't want to get involved in controversy. They don't want to report false things. You saw Dr. Oz got in trouble. He had to go testify in front of the FTC and the Congress because he promoted some diet pills. So they're just really careful in the media about what they report. But we're not afraid to do it and take it. It does take some courage, and it is our job to hold people, especially government, accountable.
Yep. Okay, so somebody wants to know what treatment worked for me. Well, I always tell him he can talk about me all the time because people always want to know what my treatment is. Do they ask you too? Because they always ask me. You're allowed. I'm giving him public permission. I can't sign HIPAA for 10,000 people, but I started with pulse tetracycline. It got me out of heart failure. Wasn't that like the main thing that we used for? He, I had nothing to do with it. He said yes, whatever, told me to do. And I pulsed tetracycline for 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. I went up to 1,500 milligrams of it a day. My head almost popped off. I then added diflucan. That didn't do much for me personally the first time. Then we stopped that. And the great thing to know, something that I learned is that when things aren't working, you should stop doing them and not wasting lots of time. I'm shocked by how many patients are like, well, I've been on Doxy for a year, nothing's happening. I'm like, what are you doing? Switch your treatment. It has to keep cycling around. Mepron was helpful for me. Artemisinin, liposomal artemisinin, which he prescribed, was super helpful, horrible, torturous, but ultimately got me from like 70% to 95% better. And I've been there for 2+ years. But I will also tell you that when I feel a little flare coming on, which I do sometimes, maybe three times a year, I very preemptively take antibiotics again. I'm not afraid to take a couple weeks, and I don't care if I have to do that the rest of my life to stay well. If these cures become available, I'll be happy to take it, but until then, that's what I got. Oh, yes, you had a question.
You mentioned that Bartonella is
Yeah, so the studies, let me repeat the question. So I mentioned that Bartonella is intrinsically antibiotic resistant, so how to treat it. So we were taught in med school not to treat Bartonella with antibiotics, that it's self-limited, and that antibiotics don't work unless people are immunocompromised. So AIDS patients were treated, and people without AIDS were not treated. So then studies came out that antibiotics actually were effective, but there were subclasses of antibiotics, so things like rifampin, Bactrim, and quinolones, which unfortunately are more toxic classes of antibiotics. With rifampin and Bactrim, you can get these idiosyncratic drug reactions that can wind people up in the hospital with low white counts, low platelets, hepatitis, pancreatitis, and I've seen them all, and they're kind of unpredictable. With quinolones, people can get tendon injury. So it's hard to just blanket put people on these antibiotics. There are a number of cases of Bartonella patients who will respond to the safer antibiotics. For example, like Zithromax has high activity against Bartonella in the test tube, but by itself it doesn't work all that well. But in my experience, if you do rounds of it, pulse it with something like tetracycline, you can get people better. I also, Hopkins is currently doing persister research on Bartonella to see what other drugs. They do these things where they go through a screen of drugs to see what either antibiotics or non-antibiotic medicines could be useful against the organism. So they're looking now
like they did for Lyme previously, for other drugs for Bartonella. So, yeah.
Do you find that IV spare or more sparing of the GI microbiome than orals?
No, I'm not. It's not so much IV versus oral because the IV Rocephin gets excreted through the GI tract. So you put it in through the vein, it goes right out through the GI, so you poop it out basically. So it's not really sparing. People get C. diff on the IV much more commonly than they do on doxycycline and tetracycline, in my experience.
What do you recommend to people who can't tolerate antibiotics? Even small doses of herbals and prescriptions spiral them out of control.
I have a patient like that now, and she can't tolerate anything. No herbals, no antibiotics, nothing. And she wants to try traditional Chinese medicine, which she's hoping that she'll tolerate. I mean, sometimes, you know, you just want to be there that if the person wants to come back and try again, that you're there, you know, so that's what I offer her. But there are other things, not every remedy comes in a bottle, and there are some alternative things that can be helpful too. My patients, a lot of folks get good benefits from infrared saunas. My patients with psoriasis, infrared saunas work. I've seen so many patients with psoriasis where infrared saunas have cleared up their psoriasis when immunosuppressants have failed, and no one talks about it. Some patients use some of these alternative therapies like Reid machines and magnetic therapies. And, you know, I think that these are all really interesting kind of therapies. I've never considered myself an alternative medicine doctor, but I'm open to everything and support, you know, and try to educate myself about these therapies and share what I know with my patients.
Can you elaborate on how you get, did you have more to say? Sorry.
No, so he raised his hand, but I
Oh, go ahead. I'm looking at all the questions. Go
I just
ahead.
had a quick question. I hope you could settle a little dispute. I live up in the woods on a lake and surrounded by equestrian farms and everything else. And just anecdotally speaking to people, especially horse people and landscapers who are outside all day, yeah, I get bitten by ticks all the time. And I can't seem to find the number of how many ticks are actually carriers of Lyme disease.
Yeah.
I see wildly varying numbers.
Well, it varies based on geography, but it's pretty high. With the adult population, it's about 50%,
Yeah.
and with the NIV population, it's about 10%.
I just read a study like in the last 3 months that said 50% of ticks in upstate New York were infected. I think it's in the Poughkeepsie Journal, and it settled some scores for me as well. Because there's people that were saying 3%, and I'm like, it is not 3%.
No,
There's too many of us who are sick.
No,
for
the 3%. I think 3% statistic is the risk of getting Lyme from a tick bite, untreated tick bite, in this area.
Okay, let's see. What do you think about stevia?
I'm underwhelmed by stevia, unfortunately. I mean, there are many herbals that I'm very, very impressed by, and stevia is not one of them. It's not one of them.
Okay. Did you mention Zithromax? Does research show that it will treat Lyme, Babesia, Bartonella, high dose of doxy together with Zithromax? Can you tell us what milligram, what prescription you
For
recommend?
doxycycline, high dose.
I think for both.
Yeah, so high dose relates to body weight, and if somebody's, you know, under 110 pounds, I don't go over 200 milligrams a day. If they're between 110 pounds and 200, I'll do 150 twice a day, and if they're over 200, I'll do 200 twice a day, and that's doxycycline. And
Okay, so I'm sorry, go ahead. Someone you,
Okay. Yeah.
I want to thank you for doing the special online reason. I also want to thank you for your videos on Facebook. It's a great, quick way to pass along information that when people aren't necessarily thinking about it, but they know that you're going to constantly spew on information. Maybe I'll go to their page and look and see what they have. It's great to have that.
Thank you.
Thank
If
you.
we can't get to all of the questions tonight, your phone was there. Do you think you can answer some of those questions on our video?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And sorry for getting emotional. I was talking about my dad. I feel so embarrassed. You're trying to save his life for a long time.
We all understand
Sorry,
that.
but that was my question, which had 3 parts and got interrupted.
Oh, what was the third part?
I'm Jill Padler, sorry.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you? So nice to meet the famous Jill.
Wonderful to meet the famous Dana. Thank you.
I was through a three-part question.
Could you go back to it, Joe?
Oh, yes.
The Zithromax that I use is 250 BID, 250 twice a day.
Yeah, there were two other on there.
It said Zithromax was mentioned as, does research show it will treat Lyme, babesiosis, or Bartonella? How many milligrams? You said high dose of doxy together with Zithromax.
So Zithromax has activity against Lyme, Bartonella, and Babesia. With Babesia, it's part of a combination of Zithromax and Metcon is the standard, treatment that they use. And with Bartonella, it's in the studies, it's not as effective as quinolones, Bactrim, and rifampin, believe it or not. But in frail patients that can't tolerate these things, like I had an elderly gentleman who had clear-cut Bartonella. Like there are some clinical features of some cases of Bartonella that are very obvious now to me that were not obvious when I was earlier on in my practice. Like everything came into focus around 2013, and so I just treated him with rounds of tetracycline and Zithromax. That was all he could tolerate, and he got better, and he had a bad case of Bartonella. It required like 6 pulses of tetracycline and Zithromax. And his C-reactive protein went from like a 60 down to under a 1. And he was, an old guy, an 80-year-old guy, and was able to treat a frail person, with that. So.
So did you say that the animal studies and the research show that Zithromax is not effective, but clinically it is? I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, so it's not to the animal studies, people studies. If they compare antibiotics, Zithromax is not terribly effective for Bartonella. In the test tube, it has the most powerful activity in terms of, or one of the most powerful activities in terms of paralyzing the bacteria. The problem with Bartonella is that all the antibiotics in the test tube even, they don't kill it except for aminoglycosides. It's the only one that kills it. Aminoglycosides like gentamicin, they can cause permanent hearing loss and usually transient kidney damage. But they don't get inside cells and they don't cross blood-brain barrier. So the only drug that we have to really, really kill it doesn't get to all the parts of the body that we need it to get to, and it is highly toxic.
I will shut up until you get your one more question on this. There is my lad's doctor who's probably retired at this point who believes in treating with hydroxychloroquine, saying an antimalarial would be the way to go with Bartonella. That hasn't been mentioned.
Yeah, so there wasn't any data until recently on that. There was the 2 studies out of Korea that support that. There's no in vitro data that I'm aware of on Plaquenil with Bartonella. There is data with Plaquenil and Lyme in the test tube. There are 2 studies, one from Hopkins, one from Norway. But with Bartonella, the studies, like the first one, it was a case of a lady who had a very high fever, like 104. They could not get her fever under control with anything. They gave her ibuprofen, they gave her IV vancomycin, they gave her IV doxycycline. It didn't work until they added the Plaquenil, which is hydroxychloroquine, to the vancomycin, to the doxycycline, and then she got discharged on that. And she actually grew Bartonella from her blood. So they knew it was a hardcore, obvious Bartonella. And then I guess they learned from her case, and the second guy had the same presentation. They gave him minocycline and Plaquenil, and he did very well quickly with the same presentation. So Dr. Danta, who you're referring to,
No, I'm actually referring to Dr. Rex.
Oh, okay. So, but Dr. Danta was the first person who made that Plaquenil combination famous, and he was treating a lot of chronic Lyme patients. And, I see a lot of those patients when he closed up, and it does help Bartonella as well as Lyme. A lot of the patients that are diagnosed with Lyme have occult Bartonella, really, and I've seen Plaquenil work as well. Yeah, so I used to use a lot of Plaquenil in the old days. A lot. It's slow. It takes a long time to work. I'm not so scared about the eye toxicity. It's like a very, very safe drug. It's just very, very slow. People go on that drug, and you can't pulse with it. So it's like a 4-month treatment usually, sometimes 6 months. It does add a lot to the treatment regimen. Like if it doesn't work and it's a failure, it's like a 4-month trial.
I'm curious about what is recommended for prophylactic and reinfection protection of Lyme in gorge tick bite. I was shocked yesterday that a friend had an engorged tick and said, call your doctor for prophylactic dose of doxycycline. The physician called back from Ridgefield Primary Care said, well, if it hasn't been attached for 3 days, I recommend nothing. Now, she doesn't know how long this attached.
Right. So I don't think there's a zero risk point at any time. The longer the ticks are attached, it's kind of like non-linear, it's logarithmic, the more risky it is. But it's not zero at any point if the tick is infected. So again, 2 weeks of doxycycline is what I use for tick bites, and I think it's well worth the risk. I was on 3 years of doxycycline for acne as a teenager. I never had bad acne. I would go and get my prescription for 6 months at a time, no blood tests were ordered, nothing. So this whole hoopla of, oh, should I give 1 day of doxycycline, 1 dose, or I just roll my eyes because, you're looking at a disease that can change people's lives in a very material way. And, I think the doctors, unless they had a personal experience, I've said this in prior interviews, I've treated over 100 doctors with chronic Lyme. When they come to see me, they've been on a multitude of antibiotics. They do not treat themselves the way that they treat patients. I'm telling you for sure, and almost all of them do not treat Lyme. They're not Lyme doctors, they won't treat Lyme, but they treat themselves very aggressively with antibiotics. So if that's not a commentary on the system, I don't know what is.
I don't want to miss this question. I hope this person is still here. Elise, I was bitten by a tick in 2014, lay in bed for, it looks like 4 years with classic bullseye. My ELISA came back negative. I now cannot walk. I was calculus professor. Is there hope for me to ever walk again?
Look, there's always hope for people. When there's life, there's hope. And so it sounds like from the question the person had a bullseye and has been chronically ill and never got any treatment based on a negative ELISA?
Yeah,
which is
she's right there.
That's kind of a terrible story. You can't, if someone had a history of a rash compatible with a Lyme rash, it doesn't matter what the test shows. And
who has been so destroyed by the negligence of a doctor who is now unemployed as a professor, and it has no funding, no insurance on the Medicaid. How do they get home?
well, I know the Lyme Connection is obviously a great source. They had a program for people without insurance, a grant program. Do you guys still have that?
Yeah.
No. Do you know of a similar? Yeah.
If you all know of other programs and we can aggregate them and put them on our Facebook page, we'd be more than happy to do that. I know you're a great wealth of information for me for these kinds of questions. There are places, there are foundations that provide.
If your doctor wants to call me, I can give the doctor curbside info at no charge.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk to any doctor about Lyme and provide education if the doctor, is not willing to treat.
We'll get 2 more questions and then we'll go.
How long?
Yeah.
6 months, people can change it, and you watch these pictures go down.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So every treatment, I always say, has to have the fair shake and the expiration date. And the fair shake varies depending on the treatment. Most of the time, it's just a month, believe it or not. And in that month, people don't have to get 100%, but there's like an aha moment that people have when they have an effective treatment. They know it's budging the needle, for better or for worse. Herxheimer improvement, it's doing something. A swing and a miss, if you're taking something and you don't notice any detectable change, it's probably not going to work.
Okay, Jill, and I have something. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let's honor our elders. Our parent father is 93 and a half years old.
Wow.
And I have felt he is a Lyme expert as an ecologist and a research biologist. He has shown symptoms since 1998, ticks, etc., antibiotics. He's also worked in the research lab and the differential between toxins because he didn't do proper precautions. He also has cardiac symptoms and major vascular dementia. My big question is, would there be a risk, cardiac-wise, of doing a trial of an antibiotic, knowing there might be that differential and time is of the essence? Could there be a risk? Somebody told me that there could be a Herxheimer risk with the cardiac history.
There is.
of death?
Well, there can be. It depends on how bad the ejection fraction is. Like my dad's ejection fraction was extremely low. And when I treated him, he didn't tell me until years later that he had his finger on the pre-programmed, button for 911 like all night, because his heart arrhythmias was so horrible with the treatment, they got so much worse. Whatever the disease, it depends. Yeah, so the pacemakers, unless there's an implantable defibrillator, like Neil said, Dr. Spector had an implantable defibrillator. So it depends on how low the ejection fraction is. And when I treat people with, let's say, dilated cardiomyopathy, I've had the honor of treating about 15 patients with that condition, and they've all gotten better. And these are all people that were on their way to heart transplants. And I treat them slowly and gradually now. We just minimize the Herxheimer's to minimize the risk.
Major fast dementia onset from brilliant, world-renowned scientists who citizens have no dementia.
Right, so my dad has dementia now, very severe, and I've tried absolutely everything. Dementia and neurodegenerative illnesses are among the hardest and most recalcitrant to treat because they develop these proteins, like I mentioned before. It was so warm when I was talking, so I was like getting lightheaded. But they have these proteins, these abnormal proteins that develop: amyloid with Alzheimer's, alpha-synuclein with Parkinson's, and TDP-43 with ALS. And once those proteins are there, if you don't get rid of the proteins, you're not going to get rid of the, you have to fix the damage that's been done, not just eradicate the infection that caused the damage. Well, I could say that with my dad's case, I said I've tried a lot of things, and, he has survived longer than anyone expected. The dementia that he has is called Lewy body. It's a rapidly progressive dementia. It's worse than Alzheimer's.
Okay. You had a question back in the blue.
Hi. Have you done any studies on the effect of having the MTHFR gene in relation to this treatment line?
Excuse me. I haven't done any studies on it, but it's a very common situation. It's like something like 25% of the population has it. When people have elevated homocysteine, I treat it and normalize the homocysteine. I don't see it as a major risk. I have lots of chronic Lyme patients that don't have MTHFR as well, but I know that people will kind of disagree with me on that.
Okay, last question. You.
Doctor, thank you so much for having us.
Oh.
My husband is bitten this Friday. Very red mark, 4 inch by 2.5 inch long, and 2 quadrant center is very dark, and I pull out, and we go to the doctor immediately, and she prescribed amoxicillin for 875 milligrams for
Yeah.
3 weeks.
Right.
Does that sound good?
Not really. Most people wouldn't prescribe amoxicillin these days. Doxycycline is a little more effective, I think, than amoxicillin, because amoxicillin doesn't cross into the brain. If you give a high enough dose of doxycycline, it will. And if you're treating, some cases of Lyme can spread to the brain very rapidly. There's a study out of Stony Brook where it spread to the brain within 2 weeks in 2/3 of the patients. They did spinal taps on them. So I think that you'd want to use an agent that crosses into the brain, and most, and I don't treat, like I said, I don't treat tick bite, Lyme rashes with just.
He's allergic to doxy.
Allergic to doxycycline?
He's allergic to doxy, right? You have an allergy to doxy, so what's the best alternative?
What does the allergy consist of?
What happens when you take doxycycline?
I have allergy for the doxycycline.
What happens?
I get a rash.
You get a rash from doxycycline?
If I take a long time.
That's interesting.
2 days okay, but if I take 10 days or something, 10 days I get a rash.
And is it a rash in sun-exposed areas? Where does the rash happen?
Sun exposure.
Where's the rash happen? Well, it's actually really, really rare to have an allergy to doxycycline. Super rare. Okay, if that's the case, still Zithromax can be added to amoxicillin, and I think that that's an option as well. At least get a little more intracellular coverage. That can happen. So I would use some kind of a makeshift way. And have you taken tetracycline or just doxycycline? No, in the past, are you allergic to tetracycline also, or are you not sure? Never taken it? Okay. Okay, yeah, so I'm not sure, but I would, like I said, I can only talk, I can't give specific medical advice, but in my practice, I would find a way to make it more aggressive than just amoxicillin, because the relapse rates would be unacceptably high for my comfort level. Minocycline has the highest rate of allergy out of the tetracycline class antibiotics. Doxycycline has the low, and tetracycline, like I said, it's so low to be allergic to doxycycline. I would maybe talk to an allergist about maybe it's worth, to see is it worth the risk of getting a rash on the doxy while you're being treated for this, It may be worth the risk if the rash isn't serious. I don't know.
Okay, we were told we have to wrap it up, so thank you guys so much for being here. Really appreciate it.